Well, hello. It is Friday. Let's get into a question. I have to confess something, which is an ironic thing to say considering the topic we're in today. I've been ducking this question for a while, and I'll tell you why. It's about the difference between view of sacraments from a Protestant perspective and a Catholic perspective. Now, I do not like it when people who are not in my tribe, not in my stream, try to articulate what I think. And so I don't know that it's right for me to say this is what a Catholic priest would say. And so I tried kind of hard over the last month or so to have a Zoom conversation with a Catholic priest about the sacraments, and wasn't able to schedule anybody. So it would be great to do that kind of thing someday, and hopefully, you know, that's something we can do in the future. But I'll take a crack at it today, and understanding that if I misrepresent a Catholic perspective, well, that's probably because I'm not Catholic and wouldn't want to speak for my dear Catholic friends and what they believe or what they think about something. But this is the best of my understanding. So the difference between sacraments in the Protestant church and the Catholic church. Well, the word sacrament, historically, for like 1,000 years, kind of had a loose definition. It could mean a lot of different, we might look at them as traditions or practices of our faith. It comes from a Latin root that just means an oath of allegiance. And that's from Justo Gonzalez's Theological Dictionary. So this is where I'm getting definitions from for this. So an oath of allegiance. It might be any kind of, you might say there's a sacrament between two friends that are, you know, ally themselves together, or business partners or whatever. So that's the general like tenor of the Latin root of it. Augustine then said, this was his definition. Augustine's definition was the visible form of an invisible grace. And in speaking with a Catholic priest in our area, these are the words that came out of his mouth, that this was the definition of a sacrament, which I think is a beautiful definition. So a visible form of an invisible grace. Now, anytime you hear the word grace, I want you to be thinking about a gift. Because as we know, grace is unmerited favor. So in general, God gives grace to humanity, a common grace, and also grace through that's how we are saved. It's by grace that we are saved. But it's always a gift. It's free. It's something that God gives. And so that's part of the tension where we have to say, okay, these traditions or practices that are religious practices, how does the receiving of grace interact with these practices or things that we might do? In the 12th century, Hugh of St. Victor kind of nailed down 7. So when Augustine talked about sacraments, he listed lots of them. He had like 30 things that were sacraments. So you can imagine he's describing religious activity that we participate in by God's grace. And so then Hugh of St. Victor in the early 12th century, somewhere in the early 1100s, narrowed it down to 7 sacraments, and they are these: baptism, confirmation, communion, penance, extreme unction, marriage, and ordination. So I think that's pretty close to the list that our Catholic friends now would say, yep, those are the 7 sacraments of the church, where Protestants would say, no, we would use the language of sacrament, although we might use that word, we might use words like sacramental as it might relate to something like marriage or ordination, but we would say, no, the 2 sacraments that Jesus passed down to us, and that's part of the big deal, is we would say these are things that Jesus passed down, would be baptism and communion, or the Lord's Supper. And so a couple of things as we might just understand what a proper understanding of a sacrament might be, at least as we would delineate those 2 sacraments from all the other sacraments. First of all, we need to think about efficacy. And the efficacy is just, you know, a word that means how effective is this sacrament. So we are memorialists, and I think this is a pretty big difference. And as a memorialist, I say, when I take communion, when I baptize somebody, this is a physical reality, a physical thing that describes something that has already happened in the spiritual realm. So somebody has given their life to Christ. They are a Christian, and baptism is the way they are proclaiming that to the world. Where if you take a view that, and I assume this is more Catholic view, again, I don't want to speak for streams that I'm not a part of, but if you were to say, no, baptism, there's an efficacy in baptism that's greater than that. So when I'm baptized, that actually is when I'm being saved. So it's still a spiritual reality, but it's happening simultaneously with baptism. And you would say the same thing with the Mass or the Eucharist, that they might say, and again, forgive me if I'm wrong, but they might say that this is a spiritual reality, true, that this wafer is not necessarily the thing that is giving you grace, but it is the act of the sacrament of receiving communion that is giving grace, is imparting grace, where we would say, no, grace has already been imparted. We do not receive grace from communion. Rather, we have received grace, and we celebrate that memorially. And you know what a memorial is. We don't fight the Revolutionary War every 4th of July, rather, or we don't write the Declaration of Independence every 4th of July. Rather, we're memorialists. We celebrate that is something that happened in the past. And so as we look at communion and baptism, we would say that I think the biggest difference would be that as Protestants, downstream of the Reformation, we view these things as a memorial of something that has already happened. We have received this grace, where maybe our Catholic friends might say it is by doing this that we are receiving grace. So then we might say, why those two? Why would we highlight and use the word sacrament for communion or the Lord's Supper where we wouldn't for marriage? Well, okay, here are the two things or ordination. I think the marriage and ordination are, I think, the best examples. Let's stick with those. Confession, what might be another one. We would say, first of all, those two are clearly outlined and passed down to us from Jesus. Jesus was baptized, and then also in the Great Commission, we were commanded to baptize people. So this is straight from Jesus. And the same is true with the Lord's Supper, that we would say in the upper room, as Jesus was having that Passover meal, he implemented something that was normative for all Christians. Now, I would say things like ordination. There's a sacramental element to that, you might say. It is something when we ordain somebody for ministry, we are saying, okay, we recognize the call. You have been given this call, this grace, and so we're recognizing it through an ordination ceremony. Or in a marriage, we might say, look, God, as the pastor in a marriage, I don't think I'm doing something. Rather, my words, the vows of these people are a physical representation of something God has joined these two people together. But those aren't normative for every Christian. There are lots of Christians that aren't married and who God hasn't called them to that. There are many, many, many Christians that aren't ordained. And even ordination is a hard thing there's many different views on ordination, all starting from the New Testament. So we would say certainly ordination is not normative for every Christian, but baptism and communion are normative for every Christian. And I think that that's a big reason why the Protestant church has sectioned those two out and said, look, the rest of these are not necessarily normative for everybody, but baptism and communion, every Christian should participate in this. And also we would say it is not because of baptism that we receive saving grace. It's because we have received saving grace that we are baptized. It's not because we have are participating in the body of Christ it's not by taking communion that we're participating in the body of Christ. It's because we have participation in the body of Christ that we are receiving a symbol of his body and his blood when we gather to take communion together. So this is maybe in practice a fairly large gap between a Catholic understanding and a Protestant understanding of the outworkings of religion. And yet, when I've had conversations with my Catholic friends and with a Catholic priest here in town that I hope to interview very soon on the channel, it's been nothing but love. It's been nothing but grace, and it's been a co-searching the truth. So be gracious, be loved, and be loving. And wherever you end up on a Sunday morning, if you have a chance to take the Lord's Supper, man, know that it's because God's grace is for you. Hey, have a great day.